Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning. Welcome to the webinar. We're delighted to have you join us today for Doing Business in Japan. My name is Ed Burke. I'm Marketing Programs Manager for Radius, and I will be moderator for today's webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to review a few quick housekeeping items. First, questions. Please send us your questions at any time during the broadcast using the questions panel on the side of your screen. During the broadcast, all attendees will be muted, but we will continuously monitor the questions panel and answer your questions at the end of the broadcast. Second, technical difficulties. If you experience technical difficulties during the broadcast, we suggest that you log out and then return to the webinar, as this typically resolves most connection issues. If you encounter persistent technical difficulties, you can contact GoToWebinar technical support. And finally, the recording. This broadcast is being recorded, and the recording will be made available to you within 24 hours via email. Well, that concludes the housekeeping items. Let's get started. Before I introduce our panelists, I would quickly like to give you some insight on how Radius is positioned to speak as experts on today's subject. Radius helps businesses move into new markets, manage overseas operations, and outsource entire global accounting and administrative functions. Our services include integrated international accounting, finance, banking, tax, HR, legal, and compliance services. Radius offers a unique cloud-based software platform that allows head office teams to manage and control international operations from their desktops. We serve more than 500 active customers who manage 6,000 plus employees in over 80 countries. Radius has a solution that will help your business expand and win globally. We are very excited to be working with our valued partner JETRO for today's session. Radius values a strong network of partners who bring great value not only to our company but to our customers. As with a range of other services, Radius has supported our clients with international expansion for many years, but partner organizations like JETRO are essential to the work we do, and they give our customers access to a range of unique strategy, legal counsel, and general expertise that really make a difference for companies managing an expansion into a new market for the first time, or for businesses with highly complex global operations. As many of you know, international expansion is no easy task, and so it is essential that you pick the right partners to guide you along the way. As you can see on this slide, the Radius Partner Network is comprised of a number of respected organizations, and we are excited that it continues to grow. We work with industry leaders like Regis, Silicon Valley Bank, TriNet, DLA Piper, JETRO, and many others who help round out the support and services that our customers typically require, from banking and office space to commercial leases, international benefits, and HR outsourcing. If you have any questions about our network of partners or are interested in becoming one, please don't hesitate to reach out. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our panelist for today's broadcast, Takeshi Komoto. Takeshi serves as Executive Director of Japan External Trade Organization, New York office. He assists the President of JETRO New York office as an Executive Director to promote trade and investment between Japan and the United States. In particular, his current focus is on Abenomics, the economic policy led by Prime Minister Abe, to business communities in the U.S. He joined the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, the predecessor of METI, in 1993, where he started his career in international affairs. We are also joined today by Diane Adachi, Director from Advisory Services at Radius. Diane advises clients on compliance and risk management and helps companies with expansion into global markets, and specializes in the Asia-Pacific region. Prior to joining Radius, Diane worked with various positions in higher education, technology, and media. She has worked with country governments in over 33 countries and led special initiatives in cooperation with Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and the World Bank, as well as the U.S. State Department on Technology, Trade, and Sustainable Development Projects. She has lived abroad in Japan and was also a special correspondent for the Japan Times, Japan's largest English daily newspaper, and has written articles on U.S.-Japan relations. The agenda for today's broadcast will begin with a review of the Japanese economy and why investment in Japan for American businesses, presented by Takeshi, followed afterwards by a review of country specifics for expansion into the Japanese market by Diane. But before I turn over to Takeshi, we will run our first polling question of the broadcast. I'll launch the polling interface for our audience. What is the biggest challenge your organization faces when expanding or operating in Japan? Please use the voting panel on the side of your screen to cast your response. We'll leave the polling interface open for approximately 10 to 15 seconds to let the audience respond to the poll. I'd like to thank the audience's enthusiasm. I can see that the audience is responding. Approximately 40% of the audience has responded at this point. We'll leave the polls open for approximately another 5 to 6 seconds to give everybody a chance to respond who cares to today. Takeshi and Diane, a clear trend is emerging. I'll go ahead and close the poll now in another 2 seconds. 1, 2, I'll go ahead and close and share the results with the audience. Takeshi, we have a clear leader today regarding country compliance for local regulations, followed at 50%, followed quickly at 19% by human resources and employee benefits, then at 19%, 16% weighing in on expatriate concerns, followed by a trailing 9% on risk management and 6% on payroll considerations. I'll go ahead and hide the polling interface and turn the presentation over to our first panelist, Takeshi.
Hi, thank you, Ed. My name is Takeshi Komodo. I'm the Executive Director of JETRO New York office, seconded from Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry of the Japanese government. Thank you all for giving me this opportunity today. I'm very excited to be part of this seminar. Today, I would like to talk about business opportunities arising in Japan for U.S. companies. I'm not so sure how many of you are aware of the current development of the Japanese economy, but in a word, Japanese economy is on the rise. In particular, what we observe now is the spectacular increase of stock price in Japan, as shown on the slide, since the end of 2012, which accompanied an increase of private consumption and gross domestic product GDP as a whole. With the depreciated Japanese currency, yen, the increase of export has also contributed to the rise of economy. What is behind this economic rise in Japan? Next. It's the Abenomics, the economic policy led by current Prime Minister Abe, who came into office in December of 2012. Just briefly about Abenomics, it consists of 3 pillars: aggressive monetary policy, flexible fiscal policy, growth strategy, in other words, structural reforms. The goal of Abenomics is to achieve 2% real GDP growth over the next 10 years. Next. I will not go into the details of the growth strategy, but foreign direct investment, meaning more foreign companies operating in Japan, plays a critical role in this growth strategy. Prime Minister Abe is leading this initiative to double the foreign direct investment into Japan to 35 trillion yen, which is equivalent to about 350 billion US dollars by the year 2020. This is an ambitious goal for Japan, but Prime Minister Abe is very serious. Prime Minister Abe visited New York last month and gave a speech at Invest Japan seminar organized by JETRO on September 23rd. His message was very clear. I will open the Japanese market and change Japan even more through investment from abroad. Next. Let us take a look at the status quo of the Japanese inward investment from abroad. This slide shows the stock of inward investment. You can see that Europe and the US are the main sources of investment toward Japan. It is obvious in a sense because they are developed countries. Next. This slide shows the US investment to Japan categorized by industries. There's a large amount of investment by finance and insurance sector. The other sectors include professional, scientific, and technical services, manufacturing, chemical, manufacturing machinery, manufacturing transportation equipment, and others. Next. A fun fact. Did you know that the Japanese literacy rate is 90%? Basically everyone in Japan can read and write. Next. So we already have U.S. companies and businesses operating in Japan, but we want more. We want your business in Japan, and we believe we have a lot to offer to the success of your business. Why choose Japan? I have listed 4 reasons why you should consider Japan as the destination of your business expansion. Reason number 1, it's the world's 3rd largest market and is integrated with Asian markets. Number 2, Japan guarantees high predictability and stability of business environment. Number 3, Japan is the place to build a dream team of global talents for R&D. Number 4, Japan is the ideal place for Asian regional headquarters. Let me elaborate further with the next few slides. Next. Reason number 1, it is the world's 3rd largest market and is integrated with Asian markets. Please take a look at this slide. You may not know this, but the nominal GDP of Kanto region, which covers Tokyo metropolitan area, is equivalent to that of the UK. The GDP of Kinki region, which covers cities like Osaka and Kyoto, is equivalent to that of South Korea. Japan provides a huge market with healthy, wealthy and sophisticated consumers. Next. When I talk to businessmen in the U.S., many say that Japan's market is closed, or there are too many Japanese competitors already that there's no room for entering into the market. But that is not necessarily true. If you have a competitive product or services, you will be able to succeed in the Japanese market. Here are the 2 examples of sectors in which foreign companies succeed in gaining a large share in the Japanese market. This slide shows that in the life insurance sector, there were only 2 foreign companies in the top 20 list in 1995. But after nearly 20 years, there are 7 companies in the top 20 list. Next. This slide shows the development of pharmaceutical market from 1995 to 2012. In 1995, there were only 3 companies in the top 20 list. But in 2012, there are 10 companies. In other words, if you have a competitive product, there's a huge untapped market for foreign products. Needless to mention, Apple and Samsung are doing great in the Japanese market. Next. Reason number 2, Japan guarantees high predictability and stability of business environment. As some of you may know, in other parts of Asia, it is not easy to do business because there are so many informal oral administrative guidance, for example. One day an inspector comes to your store and says, this fire extinguishing sprinkler must be over there, pointing to a ceiling 30 feet away from where it is right now. You may feel it very unreasonable, but you will not have the energy and time to dispute with this inspector. You will say, okay, I will move it as soon as possible, having no idea whatsoever the reason for the need to move its location. In Japan, that will not happen. It is a democratic country with a stable legal system. The predictability of business environment is secured. Another important thing when doing business abroad is the issue of intellectual property rights. This slide shows that there are very few breaches of intellectual property rights, which is not always the case in other parts of the region. Next. This slide shows the result of a survey by IESC Business School in Spain, sponsored by Ernst & Young. They use their own venture capital and private equity country attractiveness index to evaluate countries. The right-hand side charts compare Japan with the rest of Asia. The bottom left chart shows some of the evaluated items surveyed. You can see that Japan is strong in particular in the field of innovation and R&D. And speaking of R&D, let me touch on the reason number 3. Japan is the place to build a dream team of global talents for R&D. If you would like to launch an R&D team with global talents, for example, from US, Brazil, Poland, Russia, India, China, and Japan, there's no place like Japan. If you're trying to get them into countries other than Japan, even including the US, you will face a lot of difficulties trying to get them in the country because of the visa issues. In case of Japan, if the researchers have a bachelor degree and 3 years of work experience, they're in. Japan is the place for building a dream team of R&D. Last but not least, reason number 4. Japan is the ideal location for Asian regional headquarters. In other countries in Asia, you will face many issues of their own. You will be distracted by country-specific issues. And that is not an ideal place to set up a regional headquarters. The headquarter function should be located in a country which is least likely to have country-specific issues. That is Japan in Asia. Next. Japan is the largest automobile producer in the world. Next. Which sectors are currently attractive to the U.S. companies? This slide shows the percentage of companies supported by JETRO, our organization, categorized by industries. The left chart shows the companies that expanded their business in Japan successfully with the support by JETRO during the period of April 2013 through July 2014. You can see that half of the companies are in the ICT industry. The second is services, and the third is clean tech, new energy. The chart on the right shows the percentage of companies looking for opportunities in Japan as of July 2014. They have not yet invested in Japan, but are considering to do so. What is interesting is that there are many bio, healthcare sector, and clean tech, new energy sector compared to what you see in the left chart. It is true that JETRO is putting an emphasis on these industries, but it does show the industrial area that many U.S. companies see as attractive in the Japanese market. Next. The next 3 slides show the U.S. companies which have expanded their business in Japan recently. In the healthcare sector, as you see on the screen, the companies include AMS, Shire, Amgen, and 3M. The increasing population of the elderly in Japan is creating a huge demand for healthcare and its related products and services. These companies on this slide have products and services with competitive edge, and I am sure that they will succeed in the Japanese market. Next. This slide shows the U.S. companies in Japan recently in the environment sector. Some of them went to Japan on their own, and others found a partner in Japan to do business together. The companies include SunPower, First Solar, Abenomics, and Converge. Next. This slide shows the U.S. companies that expanded their business in Japan recently in the ICT sector. The companies include Neo Photonics, Reach Local, Vision Critical, and Millennia Media. Next. The last slides of my presentation show the support that Japanese central government provides as well as the local governments. Japanese central government supports foreign companies to set up R&D sites and regional headquarters. This program is run by Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. The ministry will provide qualified companies with financial incentives such as corporate tax reduction as well as subsidy to setting up facilities and acquiring equipment. The qualified companies for fiscal year 2014 program has already been selected, but you may want to look for the next year's program. The calendar of Japanese fiscal year starts in April and ends in next March. Next slide. This, next. Back one. Yes, thank you. This slide shows you selected U.S. companies who had taken advantage of this program to expand their business in Japan. I think you see familiar companies. Next. Besides the support by the central government, Japanese local governments also provide support to foreign companies. The type of support by local governments vary depending on each government, but they include incentives such as tax exemption, subsidy for land acquisition, subsidy for hiring local workers, among others. There's a portal site on such information on JETRO's website. You can check the type of support that each local government has to offer at this site. Next. Last but not least, JETRO will assist you to set up your business in Japan. First, we provide a wide range of information necessary for your business in Japan, such as information on Japanese market of specific products. Second, we provide individual consultation services on issues such as legal issues, tax issues, HR issues, and others. Third, we provide temporary office space located in 6 major cities in Japan for qualified companies. And the good thing is that they are free of charge. So please talk to JETRO first if you are thinking of expanding your business to Japan. We are on your side. Next.
Thank you, Takeshi. And now we have time for our second polling question of today's webinar. We'll go ahead and launch the polling interface. What would be the reason for choosing Japan as the destination of your business expansion? Please use the polling interface on the side of your screen to respond to today's poll. We'll leave the poll open for approximately 10 to 15 seconds to give the audience a chance to respond. As with our first poll, I'd like to thank the audience for responding. I can see immediately approximately 40% of today's audience has already responded to today's poll. We'll leave the poll open for approximately 5 more seconds. Today's results span the range of possibilities in this poll. Looks like the majority of the audience who cares to respond has done so already. We'll go ahead and close the poll now and share the results. Takeshi and Diane, it looks like the size of the Japanese market is of interest to today's audience, leading poll response at 39%, followed by 32% the location to have a regional headquarters in Asia, followed there closely by 14% the predictability of the business environment, and 11% for both a place to build a dream team for global R&D and tax and subsidies incentives. We'll go ahead and hide the poll interface now and switch back over to our presentation and transition over to Diane.
Great, thank you so much, and I appreciate the opportunity to present today on behalf of Radius. First, I thought we would take a look at some fun facts about Japan. Sumo is Japan's national sport, and it originated in Japan and is the only country where it is practiced professionally and has a history that spans many centuries. There are many ancient traditions preserved in the practice of sumo, including using salt for purification that the sumo wrestler you often see tosses in the air when approaching the ring. That's all part of Japanese Shinto religious practices. Baseball is also Japan's most popular sport, and it's interesting to note it was first introduced to Japan in 1872 by Horace Wilson, who was a veteran of the U.S. Civil War, brought to Japan to help with Japan's restoration after the Meiji period. As such, Japan's first formal baseball team was established in 1878, and since that time, the U.S. and Japan have remained important global partners. So, despite Japan's long-term relations with the U.S., it still can be very difficult to operate in a foreign country. Next. I thought I would go over some typical scenarios that we often find with many companies. You'll often have someone walk into your office and the director of HR is approached about the company's global expansion into a new country. Suddenly, the HR director is left determining how to run payroll abroad. So there are many considerations when establishing a presence. This includes, do we need an entity in country? If so, what are our options? Also, you have to think about what could be your exit strategy. How will the overseas entity earn revenue? And what is the tax impact of this? Do we need contractors or do we need employees? And what about managing expats and the local requirements for employment? So each of these matters I will be addressing in today's presentation, but first let's look at company structure and organization. Next. So why does company structure matter? This is an important planning consideration for companies. It's important to have a legal presence in country. This indicates your company's commitment to the market you are entering, and it also helps to create a commercial footprint. It also provides credibility when operating in country. This footprint becomes the basis in which you can hire and retain employees and contractors in country. It also informs the required registrations that you will need based on the structure you choose for your operations and the timeline for setup. This also determines how soon you can hire under the new entity and will affect the activities, the compliance obligations, and the overall cost of operations permitted to be carried out in country. So also to note, we'll be looking at employment terms and benefits because this can also depend on location. We need to look at without an entity what employee roles, how they need to be clearly defined in contracts to avoid PE risk, and also to note required registrations in any new country can take time. And you also may be ending up paying above market rates for additional mandatory benefits. And there are other factors that we'll take a look at today. But however, let's take a look at the types of entity you will need to consider. Next. So permanent establishment risks. First, you will need to determine whether or not you need an entity. This is driven by whether or not you have PE in the country in which you are already operating. PE is created and defined by any activity that is carried out in the country in which you may be operating and results in any revenue being generated in that country. So this can include, are you operating out of a fixed place of business? Are your employees receiving commission? Do your employees have revenue generating roles? Are sales being made to customers in country? These can often be a gray area for some companies. So it's very important to understand what your activities are, what this can result in. Can local taxes be assessed? What will local authorities consider your activities? And do you need to be formally registered so you have some form of corporate identity? Activities that do not create PE, for example, are marketing, market research, or pre-analysis on whether or not you should set up operations in that country. However, this can be a very gray area and subject to different interpretations by different local authorities. So while you may think you're just doing marketing, local authorities might assume you're already establishing business. Items that do create PE include when you're operating out of a fixed business, and that means having a dedicated telephone or fax line, employees that may be working from home, having a home address used on a business card or used as a postal address for the company correspondence. This can include if an employee receives a sales commission. It could extend to stock options. It could also extend to the job title or job description of the person that you may have operating in country. So I'll give you an example. For example, if sales are made to customers that are based in Japan, and if all the local contracts are negotiated by the local employee, even if the local employee does not have the power to sign the contract, but are substantially involved in negotiating the terms of the contract, basically they will be identified as operating in country by local authorities because they are essentially concluding contract terms. And it's likely that the local authorities would assess taxes on that transaction. So there are many things to consider when you're thinking about PE and what those factors may entail. Let's take a look at the kinds of entity types that you need to consider. Next. Oh, excuse me. Let's first, though, talk about another fun fact about Japan. Did you know that Japan has over 6,000 islands? The 4 largest islands are Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, and Shikoku. And I always like to think of Japan as being many cultures within one national culture. So every region you go to has their own idiosyncrasies and way of life, and it would be wonderful for you to see how different each island and each province requires working arrangements when working in Japan. So you may have different compliance arrangements in some of these different provinces that you might be working in. Next. So now we'll take a look at entity types. So based on the factors I just described for PE, the next step is to determine what kind of registration to set up so you can run payroll. And there are 3 basic entity types. There is a rep office, which is one of the easiest ways to get set up overseas. Basically, you can register to run payroll. It's adequate for companies that do not have sales activities in that country, and it enables you to be compliant in that country, but does not declare that you are a corporation doing business, and that's the most important factor. However, your employees cannot engage in sales or contractual matters, and it has to be under the auspices of market development. The next type of entity is a branch office, and a branch office is considered an extension of the parent company, and it serves certain geographic areas. They can engage in certain core activities such as sales, but it is not a separate legal entity, and therefore there is no veil between the foreign entity and the parent entity. So whatever happens in Japan, for example, will be tied directly to the parent company in the U.S. There is also potential for taxation of overseas profits, so you need to think about what are the tax compliance issues as well when determining your entity. The third most common entity is a subsidiary, and a subsidiary is considered a separate legal entity, and it's very popular and common for that reason. It provides a layer of protection between the interests of the parent entity and the local entity and country. However, it does take time to set up, and there is registration time, and there are many compliance regulations and requirements involved, so there's much oversight into your activities. Let's take a look, though, at the 2 common subsidiary types in Japan for consideration if you're going to operate there. Next. The 2 most common subsidiary types are the Kabushiki Gaisha, the KK. This is most widely known and the most credible and common form of company entity in Japan. There are over 95% of companies in Japan are a Kabushiki Gaisha. Shareholders are required and an annual meeting takes place. The representative director must also be a resident of Japan. And interestingly enough, the representative director is not eligible for enrollment into Japan's government labor insurance program, so that includes unemployment and workmen's compensation. This means that if this resident director loses their position, they are not able to recoup any benefits as a result. You are also required to publish your financial statements, and Japanese corporate tax is charged on your worldwide income earned by the Kabushiki Gaisha. So looking at the Goto Gaisha, the GK, this is a fairly new common form of entity, and it's becoming more popular. It was introduced in 2006, and while they're less common than the KKs, more and more companies are looking to form GKs, and as a result are becoming more acceptable. It's similar to a partnership, but there are no annual meetings required, and instead of a resident representative, you need an executive manager, which also must be a resident of Japan. In that same criteria, they are also not entitled entitled into enrollment into Japan's government labor insurance program. But another aspect that's different from the Kabushiki Gaisha, they are not required to publish their financial records, and it does not require local accounting records. So you can see why some companies choose this form of entity, because it's a little bit easier to establish and there's less compliance requirements. If there are many partners, though, it does require consensus on all decisions of the subsidiary operations. So just to review some of the advantages between a KK versus a GK, the KKs are the most credible form of company. It's just more recognizable by Japanese companies. It's more appropriate for directors who don't invest or investors who don't want to be involved in the day-to-day management. For the GKs, there's no restriction on the amount of capital investment. There's no official filing of financials. And they're able to decide how profits will be shared or divided. So those are the main subsidiary entities for consideration if you're establishing serious operations in Japan. Next, I would like to cover revenue models. So revenue models are determined by the scope of services or work that your entity might be doing or providing in a country. So this can involve direct selling, services, goods, or manufacturing. And based on the scope of business activities, you can determine the revenue model. It could be a direct or an indirect revenue model, but it needs to be reflective of the activities and compliant to the local requirements and regulations. There's some key considerations when determining your revenue model. Ensure that it needs to be at arm's length, adhere to transfer pricing concepts for corporate tax purposes, and also consider that there will also be indirect taxes such as VAT or GST on any transactions involving the sale and importation of goods. What's really interesting to note is that sometimes you might be a research institution operating in Japan. You still may be required to comply with indirect taxes such as VAT, even though there may not be any exchange of goods. So there are some different compliance regulations that you need to look at carefully in your scope of activities before determining your revenue model. This is really crucial for setting up efficient operations in the country of interest. Next, I'd like to take a look at international staffing. What should your international staffing profile look like? So the main thing is to think about, are you hiring contractors or expats? And are you looking at employees? And there's some different key considerations if you're looking at employment. If they're employees and they're expats or locals, you will require local payroll and reporting compensation in local currency. For expats, you'll need to look at immigration and visa requirements, and they must be considered and planned well in advance because there are so many timelines and regulations for the application process. And there are also more important considerations for tax planning for any expats and compensation structuring. We'll take a look at those areas a little bit later in the presentation. Finally, the most important question to ask is, are you trying to hire a contractor or an employee? And if you are trying to hire a contractor, are they a bona fide contractor? And what are these differences? That's what we'll discuss next. Next, please. Okay. Looking at the contractor versus the employee, a contractor is free to work for other companies and institutions. So that's the main thing. They do not hold business cards in the name of the company or institution. And we often have this question asked by our corporate entities. They will say we've got a local person, a local hire in a particular country, and they would like to have our business card. And they they would like to have their name on that business card. Well, once you do that, they are deemed an employee, or they will be determined to be deemed an employee by local authorities. Also, a contractor must use their own equipment, so you cannot provide printers or a computer or other resources. So the contractor must have their own resources for doing their own business. You usually do not grant any stock options or any benefits or incentives to a contractor. It is also important that oftentimes many corporate entities will have a local hire, but they do not have an independent contractor agreement in place, and it is important to have one. This ensures that the engagement with the contractor is not only compliant, but it also provides some security and guidance for the engagement. And it includes IP, use of company name, and what is it expected when the engagement terminates. So therefore, it makes it very clear how the company name is used as a contractor, what intellectual property can be retained and when it must be dispersed with at the end of the engagement. So these are things that are very helpful to have very clear with your contractor in writing. But however, you also need to note that these contract agreements, if it's a local hire, oftentimes you'll need to have it in the local language. Authorities may look beyond the contractor agreement and use their own local employment tests, so therefore it's really important to understand these differences. If a contractor is deemed to be an employee, they can be liable for back taxes, Social Security, and non-compliance penalties, and backdated employee benefits. So it's important to really look at that carefully. However, let's look at offer letters and employment contracts next. So it is important to note that while U.S. companies provide offer letters, most countries require locally compliant employment contract. So oftentimes I get a question that, do you have a general employment contract that we can use in various countries? And we often will have to state that an employment contract is only beneficial if it is composed so that it is compliant in the country that it will be used. There are different regulations for every country, and that all needs to be taken into consideration. There's different legislation and requirements as well. Also, a local employment contract usually is in favor of not only the local laws, but the employee. So you need to take a look at compliance regulations for human resources in that country as well to make sure that you're following common benefit strategies and mandatory or statutory terms in that country. You have to be aware of those local issues, if there are collective bargaining agreements, holiday pay, post-termination restriction payments, and the value of that contract at termination. So again, as I said, that you will also need to ensure that those local employment contracts are legally translated so that despite the ability of that subject in that country, even if their speaking ability might be very good in your language, you need to ensure that you have it in local language terms as well. Let's take a look at what employee benefits best practices might be. You need to be sensitive to understanding what the landscape is, what the social common practices are, statutory compliance regulations, look at language and culture, benefit practices and trends. We also suggest that you conduct local employee benefits benchmarking by the position for Japan. So although that you may try to translate that same position in Japan, it could be translated differently. So you need to take a look at similar positions at different institutions in Japan, at similar companies that do the same kind of similar businesses. You have to think about the org chart of operations in Japan and the cost versus efficiency deemed necessary for certain kinds of allowances. For example, you may have a car provided. Is that appropriate to the position, or is that deemed necessary in the country of operation? So we suggest benchmarking for industry-specific benefits as well as benchmarking salaries and employee packages. That's the best way to quantify best practices for employees. Next. So again, you look at what a good HR plan might be for you to be successful when operating in a country abroad. And again, it's especially important to identify and budget for and source the necessary resources to ensure that you're providing all the provisions that might be required in country. You may need multiple plans in multiple countries, and you will need to consider compliance regulations by country, and your HR team will need to keep up with new regulations as well. Next. Finally, let's look at managing expats. Expats can be a critical resource in helping you to grow your business in overseas markets, especially where cultural understanding and business acumen in the country of operation provides an advantage to understanding the U.S. parent entity objectives for operating in a country abroad. Sending or seconding an employee abroad, however, does create a host of issues, and tax liability is one of the most complicated challenges. A major consideration in designing a good expat package is the degree of tax assistance that your company will provide to your employee. When hiring a U.S. expat to work in Japan, for example, you might take into consideration that the local tax burden may be higher than it would be in the U.S. So there are some exclusions for taxes on housing or transportation, and you may want to make up the tax differential for your employee. The key question is that your company needs to ask is who will be responsible for making up the tax difference for the employee. So this is something to consider. Next.
Excuse me, Diane, this is Ed. With an eye to the clock, what I think we might do now is launch the third and final polling question so that we have time to get to attendee questions as we're getting close to the top of the hour, if that's okay.
That's terrific.
Thank you. We'll go ahead and launch our third and final poll of today's webinar. Does your company have an effective global expansion strategy? Please use the polling interface on the side of your screen to cast your response to today's final poll. Let's see. We appear to be having a technical difficulty with the third poll, so I apologize for that. We'll go ahead and advance directly to the Q&A period. Just getting to the final slide. Okay, Takeshi and Diane, a number of questions have come in today. Looking through the list of questions that have come in, Takeshi, it appears that Prime Minister Abe's Abenomics program is on several attendees' minds. One attendee asks, what is the most dynamic sector in Japan?
Hi, well, thank you very much for the question. It is difficult to define dynamic, but if I can give an example, just an example, but I would say energy sector. In Japan, under Abenomics, we are embarking on a series of deregulation of electricity power sector. We are aiming a full liberalization of the retail market by 2016 and separation of generation and distribution of electricity as well as full liberalization of retail rates by 2018 to 2020 period. Further to this deregulation, we are pushing for renewable energy against the backdrop of Fukushima nuclear accident, which many of you know. Solar, wind, hydro, and so on. So I would personally say this sector is the most dynamic sector in Japan at the moment. But of course, there are other dynamic and attractive sectors, and JETRO can help you learn the Japanese market of your interest. So please talk to JETRO first.
Thank you, Takeshi. The next question I'll direct to myself. Several attendees have asked if they will receive a copy of this presentation. I would like to let you all know that yes, within 24 hours, all of you will receive an email link with a link that allows you to view this webinar online and download the slides from this broadcast. Looking through the list of questions, Diane, I'm going to direct this next question to you. There's a question about sales teams. One attendee would like to know if they have salespeople in different places around the world, what are the considerations that would trigger the need to establish a formal presence or an independent contractor agreement?
Thank you for the question. One of the main considerations is to determine whether or not the activities of your salespeople have triggered PE in that country. So that determines, that is determined by the activities that your salespeople might be conducting. Generally speaking, if the contracts are being concluded in that country, the activities are generating taxable revenue, and you are probably triggering PE and will require an entity. You'll then need to determine which entity is the right entity for your purposes. And as mentioned before, you can have a sales contract being concluded by somebody outside the U.S. or outside in your own home country, and you will find that the local authorities could still deem that as taxable income and as PE risk. So that's something to think about when operating in country.
Thanks, Diane. Takeshi, I'd like to direct the next question to you. A number of today's attendees are interested in resources and incentives. One attendee asks, what resources provided by the Japanese government are available for my business to utilize?
Again, thank you very much for the question. This would depend on companies' aims and goals and the particular request they may have for resources, but JETRO would be definitely the first resource available. And if a company has a very specific request that could not be fulfilled by JETRO, JETRO can either reach out to or provide introduction to ministries and or respectable government-affiliated organizations that would be able to answer specific requests. So again, please talk to JETRO first. Thank you.
Thank you, Takeshi. Diane, I think I'd like to direct this question to you. One attendee asks, do local employment rules and regulations apply to expats in Japan?
Thank you for the question. An expat retains their home employment status usually. They are not typically subject to local rules and regulations. However, this depends on the assignment itself, if it's long-term or if it's short-term. If it's short-term, most likely no. But if it's an indefinite assignment and they habitually work in Japan, for example, it may mean that they are going to be subject to local taxes and local regulations. So that's something to consider in terms of the term of employment when sending expats abroad.
Diane, there's another question that just came in about entity setup. There's a question on the golden rule. An attendee would like to know, why is the golden rule not to set up a branch office off the U.S. parent? Could you speak to that again?
Yes, thank you. That's an excellent question. When you set up a branch in a country outside of the U.S., then the branch happens to be an extension of the U.S. parent entity. What happens, it exposes the U.S. parent to all of the activities that the branch does in that country. So for example, if there's a lawsuit in the foreign country, then the U.S. parent would also be exposed to the lawsuit. It's high risk for the shareholders of the U.S. entity. And once you form a subsidiary, it is a separate company, a separate entity that is governed by local jurisdiction and local laws of that country. So one consideration is that some corporate entities choose to set up a buffer entity, a separate parent entity as well. But that also is dependent on whether the local authorities will look at the grandfather clause and look at the grandfather of the parent entity. So there could still be some exposure. This needs to be looked at very carefully in terms of your activities and in determining which entity would be the most appropriate for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. And with that, we'll bring today's broadcast to a conclusion. I'd like to thank you all again very much for attending the webinar today. Again, as a reminder, we will be sending you an email within 24 hours with a link to view the recording of this broadcast and download the slides online. Also, if we didn't have time to get to your question today, we will follow up with you directly via email after the broadcast. To remind the audience, Radius is a leader in international business software and services. Radius can help your company set up and manage ongoing local accounting, payroll, tax, and legal and administrative services, providing you with accuracy, control, and peace of mind. we encourage you to visit www.radiusworldwide.com. Whether you require integrated accounting, payroll, and compliance services, or just need help managing local compliance in conjunction with your own accounting, Radius has a solution that fits your needs. As part of Radius's integrated Overseas Connect platform, global compliance calendars and documents for all your country operations are available to your team 24/7, freeing up resources to focus on driving your business. Thank you for your time. Goodbye.